We have a story today from the book of Daniel. So, if you remember, last week we looked at all the books of the Bible in the other room, and this is from one of the major prophets. And so, Daniel chapter 2 is where we're going to be today. So, you might know the story. You might think what's going to happen today, but this is actually kind of before the part about Daniel and his friends. So we're going to talk today about chapter 2. Now, chapter 2 has about 50 verses. So you could take some time this week and maybe read through chapter 2. And this would tell the whole story that we're going to be talking today. So this time is probably a little bit before the time of Esther, because this is before Jerusalem has been destroyed completely. If you remember, we talked about Jerusalem being destroyed, but this is a time when Nebuchadnezzar did attack Jerusalem, and he took many people as captives, and they went to Babylon. And so Daniel and 3 of his friends are what this book focuses on, being in this new place. And so I'm not going to go over chapter 1, so you can look at that later, but we're going to talk about what happens in chapter 2. And so we're going to find out that at the very beginning of the chapter, it starts out and there's a dream that Nebuchadnezzar has, and he's very confused by it. So he does what he thinks would be the normal thing to do, and he asks all the wise people in Babylon to figure out what his dream means. But none of them are able to do it. And so he is very angry and very upset, and he decides that he wants all of the wise men in the land to be killed. And so for some reason also the Bible is telling us that also then they were going to kill Daniel and his friends. So it doesn't give us a lot of reason, but that was what was going to happen. And so Daniel said, well, wait, let me hear, why is he so upset? And why is he wanting to kill all the wise men? So the man tells him, well, the king had a dream, and no one can interpret the dream. And so he said, could I go to the king and tell him the dream's interpretation? So he and his friends, Daniel and his friends, pray and ask God to help them interpret the dream. And so God answers that prayer. And so I'm going to show you a picture. So this picture has a statue and a rock that you'll see. And so in the dream, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and it has about a statue and a rock. Now you might think, well, those are kind of odd. I don't know if some of you have strange dreams. I have a lot of strange dreams, but he couldn't figure out what this dream was about or what it might mean, but God explained it to Nebuchadnezzar, and Daniel was able to go before the king and tell him what the dream was about. So I'm going to give you a little summary of what chapter 2 tells us that God revealed to Daniel. This is not something Daniel could just do on his own. God had to reveal it and show it to Daniel, and he did that. And we're going to see how God used it in the king's life. So I want you to remember mainly that this statue represents all the kingdoms that were going to be coming into power on the earth. So it's all the earthly kingdoms. So there are 5 different ones that it goes through. And in chapter 2, it's interesting, if you love history, the things that happened in that dream and the kingdoms that were represented the history that was about to take place. It was like knowing the future. So there were kingdoms that were going to come in. And so you kind of could picture, so if you think of a kingdom, you think of a king wearing a crown, right? And so he would wear the crown and be in power, but then a bigger kingdom would come in, and so there would be you could pretend there's a bigger crown that comes over that next crown, And that would keep happening. A bigger kingdom would come. And so it's representing kingdoms that you've probably heard of, like Alexander the Great. You've heard of the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire. And so all of these were showing these kingdoms that were going to be coming. But the point of this was showing Nebuchadnezzar that these earthly kingdoms would not compare to the kingdom that God, and the stone represented God's kingdom that he will prepare, and he will reign on earth when Jesus comes back someday. So this was ultimately showing Nebuchadnezzar that these kingdoms and his own kingdom was only in place because God was allowing it to be in place. And so it is again showing God's sovereignty. We kind of learned that last week in the book of Esther, when it seemed like the people were going to be destroyed, but God was still working. He was in control the whole time and working his plan, even though it seemed like it was kind of impossible. And so again, Daniel is encouraging his people that have been taken captive or away from their home, and they're living in a wicked place, that someone who doesn't believe in God, and yet God is going to keep preserving his people, because remember, there was the promise to David that he would preserve the people, and the line of David would ultimately lead to Christ being born. And so God is faithful to keep that promise. I think what I want you to think about, so what happens is Daniel gets to go before the king. So this all happens in chapter 2. So later on in the chapter, in verses 14 through 30, this is when Daniel goes to talk to them. And then in the end of the chapter, he's telling the king about the dream. Now, I want to read to you at the end, after Nebuchadnezzar hears all of the interpretation, I want to read to you the verses that it tells what Nebuchadnezzar thought about this. So we find at the end of this, Daniel goes through and explains what the dream means in verses 36 through verse 45. And at the end of this, it says this: "Just as you saw that a stone was cut from a mountain by no human hand, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold," that was all the parts of this statue, "a great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation sure." Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and paid homage to Daniel, and commanded that an offering and incense be offered to him. The king answered and said to Daniel, "Truly, your God is God of gods and Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery." Then the king gave Daniel high honors and many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief prefect over the wise men of Babylon. So at the end of that chapter, we see that God used this way of revealing the dream to Daniel and having Daniel be able to tell him what it meant. That caused Nebuchadnezzar to see God for who he really is, and to be the one true God. And he was amazed and praised God for who he was. So a king who wasn't believing was shown through Daniel that he was the true God. So God used that. He was working that plan to reveal himself to the Babylon king, Nebuchadnezzar. So God is always in control. I think that's encouraging for us, even living in the time we are now, and we think the world is doing things that we don't understand or we don't think is right, but we can trust in a God who is in control of all the things that happen. Even if we are living in a time when we think there are bad decisions being made, God is still the one who puts rulers into power, and he is making his plan happen. Even though we might look at it and think that could not possibly be a good idea, God is still in control, and I want us to remember that, and we can trust in a God who is faithful. He's been faithful, as we've learned in the Old Testament, to keep his promise to David, and that same God who is sovereign to David, and having David's line be the line that would bring Christ to the earth, we are able to trust also in this same sovereign God. I hope you do.